evening had fallen over the Vatican. White smoke rose from the chimney of the Sistine Chapel, signaling to the world that the conclave had ended. Thousands of faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square held their breath. Cameras from around the world focused on the basilica's balcony, awaiting the new pope's first words. When the cardinal protodeacon proclaimed the historic phrase "Habemus Papam" and announced that the new Bishop of Rome was Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, who had taken the name Leo XIV, a murmur of surprise swept through the crowd. The first American on the throne of Peter. The first Augustinian friar in over 650 years. No one had expected this. No one except a few people at the very heart of the Vatican who had been preparing the ground for this historic moment for months. Behind the closed doors of the Vatican palaces, a quiet struggle for influence had been playing out for years, culminating in the election of a man who would forever change the face of the Catholic Church. Welcome to the Faithful Strings channel. My name is Robert, and today I will tell you a story that has just unfolded. A story about power, intrigue, years of preparation, and a man no one suspected would become one of the most powerful people in the world. Stay with me until the end. It was September 14, 1955. In the Polish district of Chicago, in a typical Catholic family of Irish descent, a boy was born and named Robert Francis. No one could have imagined then that a child born in an ordinary American hospital would one day sit on the papal throne. America had never produced a pope, and conservative European cardinals had viewed American Catholicism with suspicion for centuries. Young Robert grew up like millions of American children. He went to school, played with his peers, and served as an altar boy in the local parish. Yet even then, he stood out for his exceptional intelligence and mathematical abilities. While his classmates dreamed of becoming athletes or astronauts, Robert spent hours in the library, devouring books about saints and church history. His parents were simple, deeply faithful people. His father, a factory worker, and his mother, a nurse, instilled in Robert from an early age the values that would shape him: humility, hard work, and respect for others regardless of their background or status. It was in this family home that his vocation was born. When Robert announced to his parents that he wanted to enter the seminary, they were not surprised. They had seen his dedication to parish life, his fascination with theology, his constant questions about God and faith. They supported him in his decision, though like all parents, it was hard for them to accept that their only son would never start a family. Robert began his studies at the prestigious Villanova University, where he majored in mathematics and philosophy. This combination seemed odd to his peers. Most future priests studied theology. But Robert had his own plan. He wanted to understand the world through both the precision of numbers and logic, and through the philosophical exploration of the nature of existence. At the university, he met members of the Order of St. Augustine. He was drawn to their spirituality, which focused on the search for truth and service to others. He decided to join them. In 1981, he took solemn vows, and on June 19, 1982, he was ordained a priest. For the young friar, this was only the beginning of the journey. He completed his theological studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, earning a master's degree in theology. His superiors quickly recognized his exceptional intellectual abilities and sent him to Rome to study at the prestigious Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, known as the Angelicum. There, in 1987, he earned a doctorate in canon law. Already in the Eternal City, Robert established initial contacts that would shape his future. He met young priests from around the world who, like him, were studying in Rome, and who would later hold important positions in the Roman Curia and dioceses. He also formed relationships with influential cardinals who saw potential in the bright young American. But Robert was not the careerist type. While his peers fought for prestigious posts in the Vatican, he chose something many considered professional suicide. He went on a mission to Peru. That decision, however, would transform his life and, as it turned out, the future of the entire church. Peru in the 1980s was a country plagued by armed conflict between the government and the Maoist group Shining Path. Violence, poverty, and corruption, these were the conditions in which the young American friar had to work. But Robert was not discouraged. On the contrary, he found a second home in Peru. He quickly learned Spanish, became familiar with the local culture, traditions, and mindset. He became rector of the Augustinian seminary in Trujillo, chancellor of the Diocese of Chulucanas, parish priest, and judge in the ecclesiastical court. In 1998, at the age of just 43, he was appointed provincial superior of the Augustinians in Peru. For many Vatican watchers, this was already a sign that Robert was no ordinary friar. His organizational skills, ability to resolve conflicts, and diplomatic talents drew the attention of his superiors. But the real breakthrough was yet to come. In 2001, the worldwide Augustinian order elected Robert as its prior general. For 12 consecutive years, he led the order, which operates in dozens of countries on every continent. At a time when vocations were drastically declining and the church faced numerous scandals, Robert managed to maintain the order's unity and guide it through difficult times. It was during this time that he began building his network in the Vatican. As the head of one of the major religious orders, he regularly met with the Pope, cardinals, and bishops. He learned the mechanisms of the Roman Curia, how to navigate the complex world of Vatican politics. But unlike many others, he didn't become absorbed in that world. He remained a humble friar who spent more time among the poor than in luxury apartments. In 2014, after completing his term as prior general, Robert could have returned to the United States and taken a high-ranking position in the American Church. Instead, he asked to return to his beloved Peru. He was appointed apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Chiclayo and, a year later, became its bishop. That decision surprised many. Chiclayo is a provincial town in northern Peru, far from the centers of power and prestige. Why would someone with such credentials and contacts choose such a place? Many Vatican observers assumed that Robert had given up, that his career was over. But they didn't know his true motivations. Robert became a missionary bishop. He traveled throughout his diocese, visiting the most remote parishes, talking with people, listening to their problems. He lived modestly, often giving up the comforts afforded to a bishop. He quickly won the love of the faithful and the respect of the clergy. In 2015, he became a Peruvian citizen, expressing his deep attachment to the country that had become his second homeland. That symbolic gesture held great meaning for Peruvians, who had long felt neglected by the institutional church. Vatican observers began to wonder whether there was a deeper strategy behind Robert's decisions. Was the modest bishop from a provincial town in Peru actually playing a far more complex game than anyone suspected? In 2020, Robert was additionally appointed apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Callao, increasing his responsibilities and influence in the Peruvian church. He became de facto the most important American clergyman in Latin America. And then came 2023, a year that changed everything. Robert was unexpectedly summoned to Rome and appointed by the Pope as prefect of the Dicastery for Bishops, one of the most important institutions in the Roman Curia. This dicastery is responsible for the selection of new bishops around the world, giving it tremendous influence over the future of the Church. At the same time, Robert was appointed head of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America and elevated to Cardinal Deacon. Such a promotion, from provincial bishop to the heights of Vatican authority, was unprecedented. Many asked, why him? The answer lay in both his past and the changing reality of the global church. Robert was an American, which gave him insight into the Western Anglo-Saxon cultural context. At the same time, he had spent most of his life in Latin America, which allowed him to understand the Church's reality in developing nations, home to the majority of today's Catholics. He spoke English, Spanish, Italian, and Latin. He was a friar in a time when the Pope sought to restore the Church's evangelical spirit of poverty, and he had experience in both pastoral work and high-level administration. Cardinal Prevost quickly became one of the Pope's closest collaborators. He implemented the vision of a synodal church, promoting collegiality, dialogue, and shared responsibility. As prefect of the Dicastery for Bishops, he had direct influence over episcopal appointments, allowing him to place people who shared his vision of the Church in key positions. Despite all this, he remained the same humble friar, attentive to others, avoiding the spotlight. This quality earned him support among both conservative and progressive cardinals. In a college of cardinals divided by doctrinal disputes, Prevost became something of a bridge between factions. In 2025, Cardinal Prevost was promoted to Cardinal Bishop of Albano, further strengthening his position in the Vatican hierarchy. And then, the Pope died. The world stood still. The sede vacante began, a period when the papal seat is vacant. Cardinals from around the world traveled to Rome to participate in the conclave and elect a new pope. The Vatican buzzed with speculation. Names of potential candidates were thrown around. Cardinals from Italy, Germany, France, but also from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Robert Prevost was not among the favorites. Despite his high position in the Curia, many saw him as lacking charisma too, ordinary. Besides, an American pope? That seemed unthinkable. And yet, when the cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel, it was his name that began to gain support. First among the Latin American cardinals, who knew him personally and valued his commitment to their region. Then among cardinals from developing countries in Africa and Asia, who saw in him someone who understood the Church outside the European context. Eventually, even some European cardinals began to view him as a compromise candidate. After several days of voting, on May 8, 2025, Robert Francis Prevost was elected the 267th Pope. He took the name Leo XIV, referring to his great predecessors with that name, especially Leo XIV, author of the groundbreaking social encyclical Rerum Novarum. The world was in shock. The first American Pope, the first Augustinian on the throne of Peter since Gregory the Palatine in 1378, a man who had spent most of his life far from Rome, working among the poorest in Peru. The humble cardinal from Chicago had become one of the most powerful people in the world. But those who knew him personally knew that power would not change him, that he would remain the same attentive listener, pastor close to the people, friar in search of truth and justice. For many, his election was a sign of the times, a symbol of the Church's evolving identity, increasingly moving away from a Eurocentric model toward a truly global community. For others, it was the result of a long and patient strategy carried out over decades by a man no one suspected of having such far-reaching plans. Who really is Leo XIV? A humble friar who accidentally rose to the top, or a master of Vatican politics who patiently built his position over the years? A pastor who wants to reform the Church in the spirit of the gospel, or a pragmatist continuing the policies of his predecessors? An American who will bring the Vatican closer to the most powerful country in the world, or a citizen of Peru who will be a voice for the global South? Only his pontificate will answer these questions. One thing is certain: the election of Robert Francis Prevost as Pope opens a new chapter in the history of the Catholic Church, a chapter that could bring changes no one expected. The halls of the Vatican hold many secrets. For centuries, they've seen intrigue, struggles for influence, and silent agreements. But few expected that a humble friar from Chicago, who had spent most of his life among the poor in Peru, would become the main actor in this timeless theater of power. After assuming the papacy, Pope Leo XIV began to introduce reforms that surprised many. He restructured the Roman Curia, giving more authority to lay people and women. He initiated a process of decentralization, transferring more competencies to local bishops' conferences. He continued ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, particularly with Islam and Judaism. He engaged the Church in fighting climate change and social inequality. At the same time, he remained faithful to Catholic doctrine on moral issues, though he changed the tone of discourse, emphasizing mercy and accompaniment over condemnation and exclusion. This balance between tradition and openness to the modern world earned him admiration from various circles. For ordinary Catholics, Pope Leo XIV became a symbol of a church that goes to the peripheries, unafraid to get its hands dirty in service to the poor. For Vatican diplomats, he was a master of the delicate art of dialogue. For conservatives, a guarantor of the faith's integrity. For progressives, a hope for long-awaited reform. But perhaps most importantly, for many people around the world, even those outside the Catholic Church, Pope Leo XIV became a genuine moral voice in a world full of hypocrisy and relativism. A voice that reminds us of fundamental values: human dignity, solidarity, justice, and care for creation. The story of Robert Francis Prevost, from a humble boy in Chicago to Pope Leo XIV, is a story of patience, perseverance, and fidelity to one's convictions. It is also the story of a church that is constantly changing while remaining faithful to its mission. And finally, it is a story about the power of quiet leadership that can change the world, not through grand speeches, but through consistent action. Behind the walls of the Vatican, events are still unfolding, events the world may never know about. Pope Leo XIV surely faces many challenges that will never become public. But one thing is certain: the man who served the poor for decades, who knew both the light and the darkness of the Church, has a unique perspective to lead this institution in these complex times. Thank you for staying with me through this episode. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to Faithful Strings. I look forward to your comments. What do you think of this extraordinary man? Will his election truly change the face of the Church? Or is this just another chapter in the eternal politics of the Vatican? See you in the next episode.